So the third joyful mystery is the subject of today's lesson, the Nativity of our Blessed Lord. Last week we began the Gospels in considering the first two mysteries of the Annunciation and the Visitation, and particularly the fact that the best way to study and to meditate on the life of Christ is through the mysteries of the Holy Rosary. And today we're going to talk about the impact of God being made flesh, the Incarnation, has on our faith, somewhat from the Annunciation and then also from the Nativity. The theology of today applies to both of those mysteries particularly. I'm not going to go into the actual theology, the definitions very much, not in a lot of detail. In the bulletin, as I mentioned, you have excerpts from the Athanasian Creed, which define exactly what the Church believes about Jesus' natures. We're going to speak about them more in general, but the specifics are there in the Athanasian Creed. In the early centuries, the fathers of the Church were still defining what we understood by who Jesus was. And so there were many heresies that came up, and so there was a lot of fighting to come to understand what it is that Jesus had revealed about who he was. And so the creeds of that time, like the Athanasian Creed, are much more detailed in that area because that's what they were defining at the time, what the theological discussions were about. So again, the exact details I leave to you to read on that, but we're going to talk about it in more general terms and the implications of it. From an apologetic standpoint, there can be no doubt that if you accept the inspired word of Scripture that Jesus is God. It's very clear that he calls himself God several times directly. He proclaims his identification with the Father, who is God, so therefore he is God. And he doesn't deny St. Thomas calling him God. We see St. Paul, especially throughout the New Testament, either speaking of him directly as God or in many other texts, the writers of the New Testament implying that Jesus is God. So there's really no question there, at least from the biblical standpoint, the scriptural standpoint. Why is it that the question of Jesus, of who Jesus is important? And hopefully you all intuitively recognize that it's an important question. I'm going to start by going through the questions from the Catechism on this that we've been studying. Question number 15 is, who is Jesus? Jesus is God the Son who became man for our salvation. Why does it matter? Because it's true. But ultimately, of course, if Jesus is not God, then our religion is false. There's no point in being here if Jesus was not God. There's nothing more important than this, and we'll discuss in the following few questions why it's so important that we accept that he is both God and man. Question number 16, what do we mean by the Incarnation? By the Incarnation, we mean that the second person of the Most Blessed Trinity took on our human nature, or became flesh, as the phrase is, carne, right? Why does it matter? Because it's true. But it's also important, as the ancient saying goes, what he did not assume, what he did not take to himself, he did not redeem. In other words, if Jesus does not have a human nature, then our human nature is not redeemed. Or if he doesn't have a full human nature. Some of the heresies said that he had a partial human nature, or there are lots of variations on it. But if he did not have a human nature, then we are not redeemed. Question number 17 is, what do we mean that the Son of God became man for our salvation? The Son of God became man for our salvation means that he came to make up for the offenses, the sins of all men. Again, why does it matter? Because it's true. But also, to satisfy justice, someone needed to atone for the sin of Adam. And I'm sure we've covered this recently, but to review, because the sin of Adam was an offense against an infinite God, and man was incapable of atoning for an infinite offense because man is limited, it was necessary for God to become man, who is capable of making an infinite act, and that is what Jesus does by atoning in obedience for Adam's disobedience. Question number 18, how many natures does Jesus Christ have? Jesus Christ has two natures. Why does it matter? Because it's true. All of these questions, of course, are all related that we're discussing today. That's why we're putting them all together, right? The fact that he has two natures is important because that's how we are saved. There are other implications, my favorite one being that if Jesus is not God, then the Eucharist is just bread, because if he's not God, then he can't make that into his body and blood. And if Jesus is not human, then the Eucharist is just bread, because there's no body or blood of Jesus to turn the bread and wine into. So without the Incarnation, without the dual natures, there is no Eucharist. Question number 19, what are Jesus' natures? The two natures of Jesus are human and divine. Why does it matter? Because it is true. But it's also important that we recognize the word fully might appropriately be added there, that he is fully human and fully divine. He's not a hybrid. He's not like a griffin, which is a half eagle or a half lion. He is completely man and completely God. And again, we won't go into all those details today, but the facts themselves are very important because of their implications. Now, while discussing the Incarnation, I want to talk about two of those implications because they're practical, okay? One of which is that because of the Incarnation, creation is now further sanctified. Creation itself is good, of course, because God created it. But by becoming man, by taking on a human nature that had a physical form, that had matter, matter is, in a way, sanctified. Now, we don't want to fall into the Eastern error that all of matter is God. No, matter is not God. God is everywhere, but not matter itself is not God. However, there is a sanctity to it in the way that it's used. And we see this metaphorically in one of the miracles of Jesus. It's one of those interesting ones, but because this is the one where he spits on the ground and makes the mud and then smears it on it. Jesus didn't need to do that, right? There is something symbolic that he's doing here, and it is a symbol of the Incarnation. If blindness in John's Gospel, in St. John's Gospel, has to do with sin, as a metaphor for sin, then curing the blindness is curing sin. And so the Incarnation we see in this is part of that. And because of that, we use matter in salvation. Christ saves us with matter. He gives us sacraments that require physical material to save us. And so there are blessed objects we use, etc. All of this is because we are hybrids, complete hybrids, of body and soul, and therefore he is saving us through matter and not just spiritually as well. And connected to that is, for example, the use of sacred images, right? That's the other point I want to make. One of the reasons why God forbids the use of images in the Old Testament is not only to not fall into idolatry, of course, because it's not the image itself that's the problem. I mean, he commands Moses to make the bronze serpent. He commands Moses to form statues of angels and put them on the propitiatory on the ark. So that's not the issue. The issue is not to make an image to worship, right? But the reason we can't do that in the Old Testament is because there's nothing to make a picture of. You can't carve a statue of a spirit because a spirit has no form. There's nothing to represent, right? You can't paint a spirit. You can paint something that you call a spirit, but there's nothing to paint, right? But when Jesus is incarnate, when God is incarnate, has a physical form, you can now represent him. Now, not everyone does it well. There's some pretty bad religious art out there, but that's not the point. The point is that you can represent him, and therefore it is something that we can do, and we should respect it. It's helpful for our senses in our prayer. I've spoken about at length, so I won't do it today, but it's important that we use our senses in worship and prayer, and so one of the implications of the Incarnation, one of the importances of Christmas, is that we can now see God. But, as always, all of this has to do with our relationship with God. And I'm not going to read those 5 questions again because it's simply Jesus, two natures, Incarnation, right? But let me talk about how this affects our relationship with him, which is something I'm trying to do every week, right? If you go back to, for example, Isaiah, it's prophesied that the Messiah will be God with us, Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us, right? When we look at the way the word salvation is used in the Scriptures, and the relationship of the word healing or health to the word salvation, it's clear that salvation can be defined as man's union with God. Jesus means God saves. In other words, Jesus is our union with God. And in God's plan of salvation, he first unites himself to us before reconciling us with God. Remember, the whole point is that we, by sin, have separated ourselves from God. We are not in union with him because of sin. Therefore, he has to atone for the sin in order to reconcile us. But he starts the process by uniting himself to us in our human nature, and then gives us that opportunity by his paschal mystery to unite ourselves to him by means of baptism, etc. We are free to choose not to, of course, because he will not force that union on us, but that is we have the opportunity to live that union thanks to Christ's paschal mystery and that he offers us through his church. There are several areas in which we can live this union. I'm just going to mention them briefly because they're all very familiar. I'm just simply pointing them out as aspects of union. None of the ways we are united to God really have to do with our passions or our feelings. I mean, they need to be subordinated to right reason, and they should not override right reason. But it's insofar as passions are passions, that's not really what's important. What's really important is our minds and our hearts, our intellects and our will. We are united to Christ in our minds, confidently accepting in faith what God has revealed through him, and in our hearts, that is our wills, choosing accordingly. In other words, choosing to accept what he has revealed and then living it out in prayer, devotions, the sacramentals, the sacraments, especially baptism, of course, which unites us initially with him, and the moral life, because again, the moral life is not about rules, it is about the conformity of our wills to the will of God. We are united to Christ when our hearts and minds are conformed to his. Therefore, we should fill our hearts and minds with Christ, bringing us back to the admonition which I will continually repeat for a while now. The best way in order to fill your mind and heart with Christ is to read the Gospels and to meditate on them. And the best way to do that is through Our Lady's Rosary. Outside of the sacraments, the best thing that we can do to learn how to live, to learn the example of Christ and his Blessed Mother, to receive the graces that we need to do so, and to fill our minds, especially when we live in a world where we're constantly bombarded with garbage, is to meditate as often as we can on the mysteries of the life of our Blessed Lord, and to receive the intercession of our loving Mother, who wants nothing more than our salvation, our union with Christ.